Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is my particular pleasure to introduce Professor Dilip Menon tonight because the question his talk poses, what time is it there, is one that unsettles the very ground on which much of our scholarship stands. It asks us to notice that our intellectual clocks have, for too long, been set to Euro American time. And it invites us to imagine what it would mean to keep different time altogether. Professor Menon is Menon is a professor of history and international relations at University of Witwatersrand, right?
Witwatersrand.
Witwatersrand, where he also directs the Center for Indian Studies in Africa. Trained at Delhi, Oxford, and Cambridge, he taught at Cambridge, Yale, Hyderabad, and Delhi before moving to Johannesburg in 2010 as the Mellon Chair in Indian Studies. He began as a historian of caste and inequality in modern India, and over the past decade, his work has turned decisively towards the question of what it would mean to think from the global south rather than merely about it. He has written memorably and uncomfortably about the division of labor that still structures so much of our knowledge production. The Brahmin as the theory maker and the Dalit as the storyteller, or what he has referred to as the method of Europhone theory and African fact, and insisted that this division is not incidental to the discipline, but constitutive of it. His work asks us what happens when we refuse that settlement, when theory is sought in the places from which we have been trained to extract only fact, only story, only data. That refusal has carried him productively away from the nation as the natural unit of analysis and towards maritime histories and what he calls oceanic cosmopolitanism, a way of tracing the long, entangled, intellectual lives that have always connected South Asia, Africa, the Arab world, and beyond, often below the radar of territorial history. So, we are in good company tonight for thinking otherwise. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dilip Menon, and he will speak to us for about 45 minutes. And the participants on Zoom at the end of the talk, please type in your questions so that we may collect them and ask them to Professor Menon. Thank you, Professor. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible with this thing on. Yes. I'd like to thank Tansen for inviting me, and it's good to see Tansen again. We've been part of several projects which involve these thinking trans-regionally. We've been with the Social Science Research Council. I'm delighted that Anna Herritzen is here. She's contributed to my volume on capitalisms, thinking about a global history. So it's good to have familiar faces, and I hope I'll get to know all of you through your questions as the talk progresses. So the talk is titled, What Time Is It There? And I've given this image from one of my favorite films, Tsai Ming-liang's What Time Is It There? And some of you may have seen the film, some of you may have not, but central to it is this young man in Taiwan who sells watches on the roadside. And one day he's approached by a beautiful young woman who wants to buy a watch. But she doesn't want to buy any old watch. She wants to buy the watch on his wrist, which of course was a gift to him from his father. So he's reluctant to give it to her, but then he's smitten, he's besotted by her. So he sells her the watch, and the very next day she leaves for Paris. And so the rest of the film, or most of the film, is about how he then lives by Parisian time. He watches Francois Truffaut, Quatre Cents Coups in the cinema halls. He sets all his clocks to Parisian time and so on. And in one sense, it encapsulates what we do with the social sciences in Asia and Africa, right? Our time is set by Western theory, by the idea of modernity, which is less a temporal category than a judgment, right? That some spaces are not modern enough. We are all, as Dipesh Chakravarti said in the 1990s, we are stuck in the waiting room of history, hoping to get there, to that goal. So how do we begin a project of new knowledge? And this is the question that I've been thinking with for the last 10 years. Where do concepts come from? And one of the things that I would like to separate myself from is this whole new decolonizing knowledge project, which imagines going back in time. So a lot of nationalist ideologies, right-wing ideologies, imagine a time before colonialism which we need to return to. And as Gertrude Stein might have said, when you get there, there is no there, right? And so this whole nostalgic, sentimental, romantic project of going back is not for me. Over the course of the lecture, I should get on to the idea of what exactly I mean by a project of new knowledge. And very often we have to think with the situation before us. And that's the politics of knowledge is a politics of location. It's also a politics of time. What do we do when we think now? What do we do when we think here, right? Those are the two questions that I'll be thinking with. And interestingly, when you think about the inauguration of colonialism and what Wang Hui has called a global synchronicity that emerges in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, it's also important to remember that at the same time, another parallel space and time emerges, that of anti-colonialism. So even as Britain renders the world pink, there is a parallel map that's created of people in movement through China, Africa, Asia, M.N. Roy, for example, in Mexico, then in China, then in Germany, and so on and so forth. So we have to think about colonialism as not having exhausted time, right? And we tend to be unreconstructed Hegelians when we think about time, that there is a singular time, but we have to think with a multiplicity and heterogeneity of times. And so this, alongside the emergence of global synchronicity is also the idea of the colonial condemnation, what the anthropologist Fabian has called the denial of coevalness, the judgment that people who are in the colonies live in another time, and they need to be brought kicking and screaming into the time of the modern. But at the same time, there are visions of time that are being articulated in the colonies through these connections. So those are some broad remarks that I want to put out there. So where do we begin? Right? And this question of, and this is an important theoretical question. I mean, this when I did a version of this talk back in South Africa, one of the members of the audience asked me, so when did we stop thinking with eternity? Right? And that's a question that hangs, is a penumbral question to the question that I'm posing. How far back do we have to go to write a history of the present? And very often, this is a question that we answer in a very short temporality. 300 years, the idea of the modern. We don't go back beyond that. So how far back should we go? Should we go back 300 years, 400 years, 1,000 years? You could think about what constitutes the time that inflects the present. And if you think about the early nationalists like Jawaharlal Nehru, when he writes his Glimpses of World History, which is a series of letters written to his daughter from prison, written over 3 years, from 1930 to 33, he puts he creates the idea of an Indian civilization that sits alongside the Chinese, the Roman, the Greek, the Assyrian, and so on and so forth. So he imagines the time of the new nation as going back, far back into a civilizational movement which connected up with the other civilizations all over the world. So it's expanding the space-time of colonialism, right? It's exploding the space-time of colonialism. So the Glimpses of World History really creates an idea of global time. And of course, this is the way a lot of people were thinking at that time. You could think about Oswald Spengler's book, which deeply influenced him. You could also think about H.G. Wells's Outline of History. And curiously enough, the communist cartoonist J.F. Horrobin did the illustrations for both H.G. Wells and Jawaharlal Nehru's Glimpses of World History. So there are these multiple connections. So this civilizational argument, which is comparative as against the abbreviated time of modernity. That's the way in which Nehru thought about it. The other is the question of genealogies and of connectedness, that the connectedness was not only with the British Empire, but the connectedness lay behind and beyond the British Empire. And these are the connections that we are trying to rebuild now when we imagine Afro-Asian solidarity, global south, tricontinental. There are always these resurgence of these parallel imaginations, where, as Benjamin might put it, you reach back urgently to the past in a moment of danger. And we live in a moment of danger right now as well. So this question of the trilogy, Nehru's trilogy, is a prefatory way in which to think about the question of time, the glimpses of world history, his autobiography, which locates him in India, and then the discovery of India, which is the book written in 1946, which actually then shows you also some of the myopia of nationalism, where suddenly those civilizational connections are lost, and India becomes a block that stretches back to the Indus Valley civilization. So it's 3,000 years of continuity in one space, right? So we can see that transition, and in many senses, the contemporary recovery of what it is to think from our spaces follows this narrow geographical trajectory determined by nationalism as well. So, so we have here an intriguing picture. Most of my lectures tend to follow the eidetic mode, as they say. I like to put up images for people so that they can think with it alongside what I'm saying. And this, for me, is an image that I've been thinking with for the last 20 or 25 years. It's so immensely productive. I shan't analyze it for you. I'll leave it to you to think with this. So what does Maqbool Fida Hussain, one of the greatest painters in modern India, mean when he paints this in 1956 and calls it Between the Spider and the Lamp? So does he mean, when we think about this binary, very often we tend to think the spider represents some kind of darkness, the spider is below, and the lamp represents enlightenment. But the spider is a sign of industry, right? Francis Bacon's essay characterizes the spider as producing knowledge from its navel, so to speak. The lamp, why does the lamp hover in some sense outside the picture? Is it an unachievable entity? Or is the lamp shedding light on the picture that we see? Why are some figures in yellow, which is a sacred color, right? Do they signify caste? Why are some figures dark? Why is there an Indus Valley seal on the arm of, and so on and so forth? You could go on for hours. One could write a book on this. But what I wanted to, why I put this up is that we really have to think, what does it mean to live with this idea of betweenness? Right? A tradition and modernity, a hyper-modernity that we desire, the chains on our feet that draw us back to some notion of ancientness and so on and so forth. So I just want to leave that image there for you, because this question of what does it mean to think beyond colonialism has always been a problem for historians in India. So if you think about the early efforts from the 1930s onwards, professional historians imagined what Indian history would look like. So you have K. Nilakanta Shastri, who writes about the Chola Empire from the 9th century AD to the 13th century AD. And it's a book worth reading because it basically tries to argue that India had empires, and the British Empire was just one in a long series. India had empires. India also had the civil services, because he has a detailed account in the book of the minutiae of administration. And you could imagine undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, joint secretaries in the Chola Empire in the 9th to the 13th century. And it's in many senses, that Byzantine structure that he creates is purely a figment of a nationalist imagination. But if you think about a book that stands at the head of Indian history writing, Romila Thapar's Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas, which talks about the Maurya Empire, increasingly historians are beginning to question the image that Romila Thapar gave us in 1971, where the idea of the Maurya Empire was dreamt up as something that existed prior to the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was not the first, that we had empires even prior to that. And we can see these tendencies in different spaces. The attempt to think about empires as a geographical, historical, political construct that preceded the coming of the British Empire, and that the British Empire is a disruptive force. At the time that I was a young man, which was in the last century, subaltern studies happened. And so many of you are familiar with subaltern studies as a movement. It's now dead. And it died in a very interesting way. It produced 11 volumes of subaltern studies which did not deal with tribals, caste, gender. So the 12th volume had tribe, caste, and gender, and subaltern studies folded up after that with a mea culpa, as it were, providing us with the 12th volume. But what is interesting about subaltern studies is that it comes up at a time where it is trying to create a way of thinking away from the nationalism of that period, the elite nationalism, as Ranjit Guha called it. And it comes up in the conjuncture of the first disruption of that dyad of the nation state. In 1975, you have the emergency, the suspension of civil liberties. And this is the generation that is actually writing history against that betrayal of the dream of nationalism, where the nation is seen as something that needs to be rescued from the state. So Ranjit Guha talks about two streams of nationalism, as we know, elite nationalism and subaltern nationalism, and that sentimentality with regard to a pure subaltern nationalism persists in a lot of these studies in Partha Chatterjee's binary of capital versus community and so on and so forth. But the point of this is that, as a wit put it, subaltern studies was a combination of British Marxism, French post-structuralism, and German idealism. So what we have here is a performance of post-colonial theory that was deeply caught up in the European enterprise of knowledge. So as soon as a peasant revolt broke out in 19th century India, people were leaping for comparisons with E.P. Thompson and Georges Roudet and so on and so forth. Most of you are familiar with these moves. And Dipesh Chakravarty's Provincializing Europe, which bookends his enterprise in 2000, where in Provincializing Europe, it's a very interesting book in the sense that it is a tragedy. It's a book that argues that Europe needs to be provincialized, but at the heart of the book, there is an idea of we need to work with the gift of the Enlightenment, as he puts it. So in that sense, post-colonial theory never departs. It stays within European theory, and that's where, or European theorizing, European epistemology, bringing in different traditions. So instead of Marx, you bring in Heidegger, and so on and so forth. So this is the impasse that we are dealing with here. And then, of course, in the 1980s, there's a parallel movement that is happening, right? Post-colonial theory is not only the subaltern studies. I mean, I shan't speak to you about Said, but there's a whole set of books which I'm working on right now. The fourth book didn't fit into my PowerPoint, which is why it's not here. So this is Edward Said's Orientalism, Ashish Nandi's Intimate Enemy, The Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, one of the most profound books to be written on modern Indian history, which I shall speak about in a moment, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. And there's the fourth book that is usually not brought into the argument, Syed Hussain Alatas' The Myth of the Lazy Native. I think these four books form a map of thinking about an anti-colonial imagination, and which resist the idea of Europhone theory, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it. As decolonizing the mind is about moving away from the idea of African fact European theory, and we could replicate this idea, Indian fact European theory. Gopal Guru has argued for Dalit fact Brahmin theory. So these binaries where the theory comes from outside the experience of the group being written about. And of course, this idea has always been present. So when you think about Tagore's lectures on nationalism, which were done in the second decade of the 20th century, and Tagore goes around wagging his finger all over the world at the United States and at Japan, chastising them for their chauvinism and saying, your nationalism is not going to lead you anywhere. One of the ideas that is central to his lectures on nationalism is that we cannot write our histories with histories that come from elsewhere. And that stands at the head of the project, as it were. How do we write our histories? Where do our examples come from? And in many senses, we have to think about theory in its plurality, not theory with a capital T, but multiple theories that we need to bring into conversation, which is what the latter part of the talk will be about. And what I like to call, which is in a paper that I'm writing, I call theorizing with the italics. Right? Very often what happens is that all the multiple languages that we speak, Malayalam, Bengali, Chinese, you could go on, we introduce words in italics into a text that's largely in English, and we imprison them in a prose that comes from elsewhere. So what does it mean to theorize the italics? What does it mean, to put it figuratively, to write entirely in italics? Right? What would that enterprise really mean? So here are some propositions. I mean, this is just to take you through some of the history of thinking about decolonizing theory. We all know about the arguments about decolonization and decoloniality, that there is political decolonization, and then there is the epistemic decoloniality that people like Walter Mignolo, Silvia Cusicanqui, Maria Lugones, Enrique Dussel, the entire Latin American cohort of thinkers have been talking about, or Bob Marley, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, right? So there's a sense in which you can think about a decoloniality that recognizes that we live even now in a time of empire, right? The political economy of academe, for example, or as Ann Stoler has called it, imperial durabilities. And looking at the world right now, and I teach an unfortunate discipline called international relations, right, which has as its premise the international rules-based order, the liberal international order, and other such delusions. And so when you look at the world around us, Ann Stoler's idea of imperial durabilities, and which structures the political economy of knowledge, who publishes what and where, what needs to be read in order to publish an XYZ journal, so on, a whole set of questions of that kind. And also the idea that the modernity is that obscure object of our desire is actually a judgment, right? Iran is attacked as non-modern. The Palestine, the genocide in Gaza can happen because these are non-modern people, right? They are subhuman, therefore, and so on. You can multiply the examples. So the idea of modernity is not merely a neutral transition, a secular transition, or a temporal category. It's a judgment on people and on spaces. So how do we continue to work with the idea of modernity, which is a product of coloniality, which is why the Latin American thinkers do modernity/coloniality as one idea. So producing theory in its plurality also means that we need to move away from the ideas of commensurability, right? An easy commensurability, which is to say that when you think about the works that Indian philosophers or African philosophers have done, where they ask questions like, are there concepts of mind, matter, logic in African philosophy and Indian philosophy? They're trying to render it commensurable to an analytical philosophical tradition, right? So this idea of commensurability, this easy commensurability, is something that we need to resist. We need to ask, what are our questions? And again, this is something that I shall come back to. And very often when we resist the idea of commensurability, we have to think with what the Caribbean theorist Edouard Glissant has called opacity. That sometimes concepts may not travel. They need not travel. Right? This is not to say that there is something unique to those concepts. Oh, only the Chinese will understand it, or only the Bengali in Medinipur will understand it, and so on and so forth. Right? The idea of opacity is also a temporal idea, that given time, given work, given practice, that these concepts may acquire a certain visibility. Opacity is the hammock on which you rest as you work at the idea. Similarly, when you look at Barbara Cassin's Dictionary of Untranslatables, the idea of untranslatability is, again, as you know, is not about ideas being untranslatable. It's about giving pause, right, to resist that easy commensurability. And again, when we think about the global South and the ideas, the space within which we are carrying on this conversation, formerly colonized people, people who resist the binary of the North and the South, of the loci of power, and so on, increasingly I've become less comfortable with the idea of the global South, thinking with Amitav Ghosh's idea of the great derangement. We live in an age of planetary crisis. What does it mean to further section the world into the global North, the global South? How do we think with the planetary? How do we move away from the Anthropocene? But I shan't be talking about all of that. That's the substance of the work that I'm doing now, where I'm working with ideas of divinity, animals, and so on, but it's still too raw, and I don't want to sound delirious. So this question of unfinished business, right? That this theory of unfinished business requires us to begin and to begin again. So what does it mean to begin is the question that stands at the heart of this enterprise and is at the head of this enterprise. And here is where I take up 3 propositions from Ashish Nandy. That book rewards reading and rereading. I first read it when it came out in 1983. That's around 40 years ago. But it's still something that commands our attention because Ashish Nandy asked questions that arose from a very deep political moment in the 1980s, even as subaltern studies was moving away and asking the question about what does it mean to be nationalist. Ashish Nandy was asking the question of, have we recovered from colonialism? Right? So the loss and recovery of self under colonialism. So I'll read out to you 3 sentences from his book. The first proposition, colonialism colonizes minds in addition to bodies. It generalizes the concept of the West from a geographical and temporal entity to a psychological category. The West is now everywhere within the West and outside. It structures our minds. So the West is not merely something out there, and you can't say hyper-real Europe and so on. The West is in us. Right? And in the way we think, in the way our pedagogy is conducted, which is why in South Africa we had that entire movement to decolonize education where the students said, don't teach us this nonsense. And the university responded. And so what we teach now is very different from what I taught 10 years ago. It's not very often such moments come, and which is why it's so exciting to teach in South Africa. But interestingly, when you say the West is inside us, it's a psychological category. One example I could give is this phrase from Ranajit Guha's Dominance Without Hegemony, where he says there was one battle that the British never won. That was the battle for the Indian mind. Arguably, that was the only battle that the British won. Right? They left India. Right? But this was the battle that they actually won. But this was an old-fashioned nationalist stance. And this is something that we need to think about, where the West is inside us, because Guha reaches for Hegel at the slightest opportunity. Right? I mean, regardless of what he's speaking about, just as Dipesh Chakravarti reaches for Heidegger. I mean, there are other stories that I could tell Tansen, which are very local, but then we shan't go there now. The second proposition that Ashish Nandy gives is that conventional, and this is important, conventional anti-colonialism too could be an apology for the colonization of minds. It is possible to opt for a non-West, which itself is a construction of the West. And that is indeed exactly what is happening in India. The Indian Hindu nationalist movement is deeply invested in the Orient that was created by William Jones and Colebrook. You know, the idea of a Hindu empire, the idea of a Hindu empire that actually existed before the Muslim empire, where the entire history of India is thought about through these divisions and through reaching back to a past prior to British colonialism, prior to the Mughal Empire, and so on and so forth. So it's possible to opt for a non-West, which itself is a construction of the West. And this is the danger that we need to think with. The third, and this is where we begin, the meek inherit the earth, he says, not by meekness alone. They have to have categories, concepts, and even defenses of the mind. It's important to remember here, this is a fact that most Indians forget, that part of Ashish Nandy standing apart from the mainstream comes from the fact that he's a Christian, that he's not a Hindu. Right? People just assume, he's a Bengali Bhadralok, he's Hindu, and so on. So this meek inherit the earth, this echo of the Bible that's present in his revolutionary credo, the meek inherit the earth not by meekness alone. They have to have categories, concepts, and even defenses of the mind. So where do we go from here? So obviously this can't be a singular enterprise. One can't go backwards, right, in time. One can't just spread one's wings within the nation. one needs to think beside the nation. And one needs to think across, or think with the idea of conversations that are happening. Conversations, staying with ideas, opacity, untranslatability, all of these are part of a larger enterprise. It's not a singular enterprise, but an archipelagic one, to borrow a phrase from, a word from, or concept from Edouard Glissant. So when we think about the global south, the tricontinental, Afro-Asia, we're thinking about conversations between places that are not necessarily next to each other. Right? One of the first laws of geography is that places near each other, contiguous to each other, influence each other. But here we are thinking about, let's say, a figure like Emin Roy, who lands up in Mexico, goes to Germany, goes to China. We are thinking about emerging conversations between Chinese, Africans, Indians, South Americans. So in this conversation itself, or in this talk itself, there is an archipelagic vision that I'm trying to put before you, that the conversations need to be broader, need to be deeper, need to be wider, and so on. And here, of course, the global south can act as a placeholder. And as I suggested, I have a sense of unease with the idea. And so when we reach for these conversations, what are we drawing upon? And here is again where we come up with the idea of what Maria Lugones called the colonial wound. Maria Lugones is an Argentinian philosopher and feminist. And what she argues is that there is the colonial wound means that there is no easy reaching back. You don't say, aha, I need to depart from Derrida, let me look for a local philosopher, right? And it can't work like that. Also because to give you an example, I mean, you could read a contemporary book of European philosophy, and Plato, Augustine, Derrida, Agamben, they can all be on the same page. Think about a text written in India. There is a caesura, there is a break. You write about modern India. Very few modern Indian historians, modern Indian thinkers will go back to Kautilya from the 2nd century BC, or go back to classical Indian philosophy, because that's ancient India. It's no longer relevant. It's no longer relevant for the present. I almost did a Trumpian gesture there. It's getting to me. So this question of when you think about the colonial wound, you think about reaching back, all of these questions are what do you reach back to? And the great Indian literary critic Ganesh Devi called it living after amnesia. We live after amnesia in our colonial spaces where there isn't that continuity that we can imagine. Remember, Western continuity in philosophy is also an invention of the late 19th century. This is something that Martin Bernal has written about more controversially, that Egypt stood at the fount of European thought until Philhellenism in the late 19th century, and then Greek becomes the filiation, and Egypt retreats into Africa, right? And as a result of colonialism and so on. So this question of reaching back into the past is a difficult question. So we need to move from a solipsism, a particularism, a nativism to the archipelagic. We need to think with the idea of the colonial wound. We need to think with the idea that we live after amnesia. And with Walter Mignolo, who has alerted us to the temporality of colonialism, right? Very often when we think about empire, we think about the French-British Empire. What the Latin Americans have reminded us that we were colonized earlier and we became independent earlier. So you go back to the 16th century, and it's not the French philosophe, but the Spanish conquistador who stands at the head of modernity. It is a violence that undergirds the production of knowledge and the spread of the spreading of a certain kind of political entity across the world. Kwan-Sing Chen's Asia's method, which begins to talk about the conversations that are emerging between Asian countries, within Asia, the question of what is universalism, what is particularism. And as Wang Hui has compellingly argued, universalism is nothing but a particularism writ large, right? So particularism plus violence gives you universalism. Right? When you think about European particularism, it becomes translated across the world through wars of conquest, which is why we so readily work with these ideas. And you may remember that famous phrase, which is often attributed to Heidegger, but it actually comes from a Yiddish scholar, that a language is a dialect backed by an army, and similarly, universalism is a particularism backed by an army. And you could think about the works of the feminist Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter, who asked, what is this idea of human that Enlightenment speaks about? Because that idea of the human doesn't encompass the slave, it doesn't encompass the colonized, and so on and so forth. So many of these categories that are our inheritance are already tainted by Western power, but where do we go, right? We can't reach back, or we have to engage in that painful task of constructing a genealogy, making filiations with the past. There is work to be done. We've gone beyond critique. It's not enough to just keep saying Eurocentrism now. We need to do the work. And that is the work that I hope to be doing here, and which we have been doing with a lot of colleagues across these continents. So creating these maps of affinity. So I returned to Said. But I returned to Said, a book that very few people actually read now. This is Said as literary scholar before he became the political intellectual who spoke truth to power, as he himself put it. So this is a book called Beginnings, written in 1985. It's written shortly after his book on Conrad. And it's a book of a different order. Right? It's a book that is more difficult to read for one, unlike Culture and Imperialism and Orientalism and so on, which are written for a broader public. So what does Said mean when he says we need to begin, right? And what does beginning involve as a project? And one of the important things that he says is that when you think about the idea of beginning, we are opposing it to the idea of origin, right? Origin is the kind of idea that we're thinking about when you think about the decolonizing schools that are adopted by Hindu nationalism. You go back to the dark backward and abysm of time, as Shakespeare puts it in Tempest. Right? Whereas this is about a secular versus a religious beginning. It's about beginning now in the urgency of the present and trying to think, what is it that we need to address? The second is that it is an activity that implies return and repetition. It's a staying with, rather than a simple linear, right? Simple linear accomplishment. We're not moving towards a set of concepts that will suddenly clarify for us what the world is. The world suddenly becomes transparent to us. That it implies return and repetition. Return, for us, it means in India, you could return to classical Indian philosophy, right? And work with the ideas that resonate with the present, that work against the political order of the present, and so on and so forth. It's a return and repetition. It's about making or producing difference. That's a third concept that he puts before us, where he says that we combine the familiar, what appears to be familiar, with the human work in language. Think about the phrase from Bourdieu, things go without saying because they come without saying, right? There is a naturalness of an order that's presented to us. How do we combine the familiar with the work in language to disrupt the familiarity of inheritance? And that includes Western concepts as much as many of the shibboleths we take for granted in our own culture. And the critic then becomes a wanderer. And here he kind of prefigures much of post-colonial theory, where the critic is always exterior and in between. Think about Homi Bhabha's idea of interstitiality, that you're not within one tradition nor entirely suborned by another, that you wander between these in an attempt to create a conversation, right? The critic as wanderer, and the intention, it's called Beginnings, Intention, and Method. The intention is the link between the idiosyncratic view and the communal view. Why are you thinking this? This is a solipsistic enterprise. No, it is not. This idiosyncratic view addresses the urgent concerns of the present, right? So this thinking is towards transformation. The thinking is not towards thinking itself, right? You're not like the spider, right? You're like the spider moving towards a lamp, if you're to conflate categories here. And there's a wonderful quotation that I want to leave with you, which is one way in which Said in the book artfully sums up his arguments through apposite quotations, so to speak. I mean, it's the wonderful literary method of the time. where Paul Valéry, the French poet, he has a sentence on Leonardo da Vinci, and he says, ask the question, what is philosophy, right? And he says, philosophy is an effort to transmute everything we know into what we should like to know, right? Which goes back to some of the propositions that I've spoken about, combining the familiar with human work and language, and so on and so forth. Now, this is the way of thinking that a lot of historians find very irritating, because I've not given you a single fact as a takeaway. This is an imagination of a feast without the food, perhaps. But I work largely as a historian of ideas, so I'm hoping that you will bring your own experiences to some of these concerns, which I think are pressing for all of us. So here I'd like to put two thinkers before you, two thinkers who have very deeply influenced the way I think about these issues. So then, if we think with the archipelagic, if we think with the conversational mode of philosophy, we also are very often drawn back to the question of place. Is there a Chinese way of thinking? Is there an Indian way of thinking? And so on and so forth. So A.K. Ramanujan, who was one of our well-known poets and translators, who taught at Chicago for the better part of his life, wrote a wonderfully ironic essay called Is There an Indian Way of Thinking, with a question mark. The question mark is important because obviously it's a query rather than a statement. And he begins wonderfully the essay by thinking about what he calls the method of Stanislavski, the question of emphasis. So if you read this sentence, depending upon what you emphasize and which word you emphasize in the sentence, you could get a different set of answers. Is there an Indian way of thinking? So that would imply that there was an Indian way of thinking, right? Or is there an Indian way of thinking? Are we thinking about Indian thinking in its singularity or in its multiplicity? Is there an Indian way of thinking? And asking, well, is there something called Indian? And so on and so forth. So it begins with this playful idea of emphasizing these particular words and thinking about the landscapes they create. And then he says, well, perhaps what distinguishes Indian ways of thinking from Western ways of thinking is that Indian ways of thinking are context sensitive, Western is context free. So you think about Kant, for example, right? The categorical imperative, and so on, it's context free. Whereas in India, if you think about that great occasion in Indian history, where in the Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna stands on the battlefield and he sees before him his relatives, his teachers, and so on, and he is paralyzed. He can't kill. And as he's in the middle of the war, of course, it's like an opera. Everything is paused while he mulls over this philosophical dilemma, and everything is still on the battlefield. And then Krishna, his advisor, tells him, look, it's very simple. Who are you? You're a warrior. And as a warrior, and this is a battlefield, what you need to do is kill. And it's important to understand that you're not killing the body, you're killing the soul, and the soul is immortal, and so on and so forth. So it's a very context-sensitive thinking. A warrior's function is to be a warrior. And then, of course, having provided us with the solution, Ramanujan then ends the essay on a note which again throws the question into crisis. He mentions the case of a man mentioned in Buddha's speeches, where this man is caught in a flood. And so he reaches for a log to carry him to safety. And he's so grateful to the log that he carries the log on his back for the rest of his life. Right? So the essay moves through these various registers, and it's a bit like Can the Subaltern Speak essay, right? Where the question is, when you're asked, can the subaltern speak? Yes, no, maybe. It's very difficult to know what exactly that essay is arguing. Similarly here, is there an Indian way of thinking? Perhaps, maybe not. Eduardo Viveros de Castros, and I'm coming to an end. I can see the signs of flagging before my very eyes. As we know, 30 minutes is the limit of human tolerance of another man wittering on. So what Viveros de Castros argues is that it's not we are on a wild goose chase if we pursue the idea of an indigenous manner of thinking. that there is a Chinese manner of thinking, or there is an Indian manner of thinking, and so on and so forth. What he argues is that it's the objects of thought that we need to think about, that different societies think about different objects. So for Eduardo de Viveros de Castro, he's thinking, why is it that in Amazonian societies, a jaguar, for example, becomes an object of thought, right? And so the idea is not about a way of thinking, but the objects of thought that we need to think about and the possible worlds that these concepts project. And he argues, like Said, that a philosophical activity that maintains a meaningful relationship with life is what we need. That is can't be a solipsistic activity. And of course, he too militates against the idea of commensurability, the idea of saying we have this concept, Europe has this concept, and these two are similar, and we can have a conversation. The conversation lies in the hardness of incommensurability and of untranslatability and of opacity and so on and so forth. Some of the ideas we visited earlier. And he has a very dry remark, where he says that comparing the commensurable is a task for accountants. It's like creating a balance sheet, right? So you total up. This means this, and now everything, at the bottom you can say this equals this and so on. He says commensurability is not what we need to strive for. So I'll end with, on a narcissistic note, with a book that I edited, a book of great significance called Changing Theory, Concepts from the Global South. And this was an entire enterprise of herding cats. There were 20 scholars working with 16 languages from multiple disciplines, and it took 6 years to bring the book together. So those of you who are interested in new knowledge know it doesn't come easily. But what I want to put before you are two ideas from this book which encapsulate what the method is. So obviously, we've gone through various ways of thinking about knowledge, going back to classical knowledge, thinking with the West, conversations with the West, conversations across the global South, and this is part of that enterprise. But what I've been thinking with is the work of Bakhtin, where he says words come to us not from dictionaries, but from the mouths of people. Right? So what does it mean to think with everyday words? Words that we use in our conversation, which also have a conceptual weight. The words that your mother uses to chastise you might be the same words that the dictator uses to chastise a population, and so on. So words circulate through multiple spaces, from the domestic to the political to the international. So thinking about words that come out of people's mouths and in multiple languages, so you're not drawn into the enterprise of, for a project of new knowledge, we need to go back to the Vedas, we need to go back to Islamic classical philosophy, we need to go back to Confucius, because there is enough philosophical, anthropological work for us to be done around us in the words that people use, which connect up with ethics, politics, self, love, difference, and so on and so forth. So 2 words. The first word is a word in Zulu, isitungutu, and this is a word that you needn't feel fazed by, because very few Zulu speakers know the word as well. And that is because this word exists only in the margins of a book that James Stewart, the Christian missionary, was compiling in the 19th century. So he comes to South Africa, James Stewart, and he does what missionaries do, which is to gather words, create a dictionary, as prior to the enterprise of then translating the Bible, and then winning hearts and minds towards a larger ecumene. Right? So James Stewart's enterprise comes to be known, and that he's gathering words, and he's accosting people in the street. What is the word for love in your language? What is the word for property? And so on and so forth. So there's an old gentleman called Tununu, who's a relative of King Shaka Zulu. King Shaka, as we know, forged the Zulu Empire, defeated the British in the first instance, and so on, a legendary figure. And James Stewart is over the moon, because he hears that Tununu wants to speak to him. And Tununu is an old man of 80. The train, one of the benefits of colonialism, has just been introduced. He gets onto the train and he goes all the way to the city of Durban to meet James Stewart, and James Stewart is excited. As soon as he meets Tununu, he starts plying him with questions. What is the word for this? What is the word for that? How do you think about the cosmos? And so on. And then Tununu says, all you have to do is ask questions and read and write. As for me, I'm isitungutu, which means bewildered, bothered, fussed. And then he also says, it's because your questions are not my questions. This is the foundation of my entire enterprise of knowledge, that we come to the world with different questions, and then we are suborned into questions that come from elsewhere. We ask ourselves, do we have capitalism in India? Do we have civil society in India? And so on and so forth, instead of asking, what is it that we do have in India, right? And so when Tununu says, your questions are not my questions, that's the inauguration of an entire knowledge enterprise. The second word is a word that some of you may be more familiar with if you're from South Asia or know Arabic, Persian, and so on, the word awqat. Urdu, Arabic, Hindustani, Persian, and so on. And the word awqat comes up in different circumstances. It signifies status. It also signifies a presumptive status. So in Hindi films, right, words come to us out of people's mouths. In Hindi films, you'll have somebody who's a subordinate who speaks up in front of a superior, and the superior will say, what is your awqat that you can speak to me like this? That how dare you presume to speak from your low status to me? It signifies hierarchy. Francesca Orsini goes through the meanings of the word awqat in 19th century dictionaries, and then she does a dexterous act of thinking about the etymology of the word awqat, which is related also to the word waqt, which means time. You can see where this argument is going. Status is a matter of time. Or as Hindi film dialogue would have it, ye time ki baat hai bachchu. So, and things can invert, right? Mera time aayega, etc., etc. The various ways in which the idea of status is connected to time. So then she moves forward to the 1990s, where there is the rise of a Dalit former untouchables who call themselves Dalit political movement, and you're the first Dalit chief minister. And then Dalits are asking Brahmins and upper caste, what is your awqat that you can treat us like this? Right? So this question of your questions are not my questions, and the question of status and time. And now the whole enterprise is asking Western theory, what is your awqat? And I'll stop there. I'm sorry, is there any water there? This has dried me out, the coffee. Thank you. Thanks.
Now that we've had him speak for about an hour and dried him out, we actually have about half an hour to ask him questions about this really provocative talk. And yeah, let's get started on the questions. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. I'm Aparna. I'm a PhD candidate at Fudan University. And then also kind of studied history at University of Delhi as well. So my question is as we know your work engages with the concept of from the global south, I am kind of wondering about the limits. If social science vocabulary is wholly shaped by European history, and if we want to study about social phenomena from India like caste, then how do we do it without using vocabulary of Eurocentrism? So
I think there's many questions within that single question. So is it like that we practice some kind of disengagement or delinking, as Samir Amin suggested a long time back, which is what a lot of the decolonial thinkers suggest as well, that we say, okay, we shall have nothing more to do with Western theory. Right? That's not the argument here. The argument here is about conversation, one. So we have an inheritance, we live in a space where there is already a political economy of knowledge within which we function. I think about Ngugi wa Thiong'o fairly early on in the 70s when he decides not to write in English. And he starts writing in Gikuyu. And then he has to create an entire readership for his Gikuyu because there is no tradition of the novel in Gikuyu. And then he comes back to writing in English and he moves between these two languages. Right? So this question of delinking is not the one that I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is the conversational mode. Jonathan Chimakonam has suggested a conversational mode of philosophy. The second is that if you're working on ideas like caste, one of the dire things that has happened in India as a result of Marxist influence is that most of our upper caste academics, and they are largely upper caste academics, say caste is class. And that given time, caste will become class, then we can study it as class. Right? So it's an act of prestidigitation, like a magic trick. This is not that. Now look here, let's study this. So obviously that's not the way we wish to go. So I'm not sure how familiar you're with the works of Ambedkar. Right? B.R. Ambedkar, who was our most prominent Dalit intellectual, the first law minister of independent India, the architect of the constitution, etc., etc. If you read his works, there is a constant global imagination that informs his work, right? So he's drawing upon people like John Dewey, on Durkheim, on Bagehot, the constitutional philosopher. He's drawing upon the Buddhist traditions. He's drawing upon the indigenous political traditions that come to him from Maharashtra. So he's putting all of these into conversation in order to find a place for himself in the world and a place for Dalits in the world. That is the method that I would adopt. And particularly when you think about a phenomenon like caste, in itself, it is peculiar to India. That by analogy, you could talk about, like Isabel Wilkerson did most recently, or Oliver Cox and W.B. Du Bois did in the earlier era, where they argue that race is a form of caste, that there is a particularity to inheritance, that race is written in your blood. Race precedes you, race continues after your death, so to speak, as with caste and so on and so forth, right? So it is in the space of these conversations, which are global conversations, where we have to bring our voice, our vocabularies into it, rather than merely rendering caste commensurable. Caste is like class, caste is like race, and so on and so forth. Ambedkar's work resists that. There is this constant agonized conversation that he has with his tradition, or the tradition that in which he can only be subordinate if he belongs, and the larger global field of knowledge which cracks open local concepts for him, allows him a different purchase on it. That's a long answer to your question, but I think it's a very large question you're asking there. And there are no easy answers, right? It's not about saying, okay, now I will start reading Sanskrit, or now I'll start reading Marathi, and so on. It's not, we have to continue with this conversation because ideas come to us from everywhere. And one of the most profound books written on caste recently, written by the Dalit scholar, alas no more, Aniket Zavre, Practicing Caste, looks surprisingly at the one thing that characterizes caste in India, touch, right? And you think this book came out only 10 years ago. And this puts touch at the heart of understanding caste. Think about untouchability and think about the fact that we play cricket, right? Where nobody has to touch one another, right? Whereas other countries play football, which is a more engaged enterprise. And that, by the way, is a joke. But it is our national game, and there's much to be. Sorry? Yes, and Kabaddi is played in Maharashtra, right? And you think about Kerala doesn't play cricket, right? Kerala, the state where I come from, which has a communist government, has had years of social transformation. We don't play cricket, we play football. Goa plays football, Punjab plays football, the Northeast plays football. They've begun to. And it's interesting. Punjab has the largest number of Dalits in India, right? And so they've turned to cricket. So there is something there that needs thinking about.
Thank you for what was genuinely probably one of the most inspiring talks that I've heard in a while, because my bar at this point is, will I leave this talk having learned anything new, let alone of value? And you have achieved both for me. So thank you. I mean that genuinely.
Thank you.
I do have a strange question that I probably can anticipate already your answer, because it seems to me that the dialogical model that you've kind of described leaves us with a couple of choices, several of which you've already said no to. We can either use the Western model of social scientific categories and language to drive analysis of the world, not just the West, but the non-West. Or we can figure out the words that are coming out of the mouths in the local so that we can engage with that authentically, truly, honestly, sincerely, transparently. What about taking the words out of the mouths of the local to understand the West? That seems to me to be a theoretical direction that very few people actually engage in. And if they do, it's always then from a deeply problematic, essentializing version of, well, we have to understand other cultures through our essentialized categories. The reason I ask that is because I'm a weird, I think, relatively modern hybrid. My father's Filipino, my mother's German. I grew up in the United States. I am the product of American empire, of globalization. My brother is too. He speaks with an American Southern accent because he lives in South Carolina. The reason I study Europe is because I wanted to understand that thing.
Right.
Not because I'm a part of it by choice, but because I'm a part of it by history. And I do think we're capable of taking also the local experiences and discourses and languages and concepts that we derive as human beings growing up in this world that are about power relationships, and then using those to deconstruct that thing that we call the West. Why is that not on the table in so many of these kinds of theoretical exposés? Because I'm convinced by everything, but that's a directionality that is under-theorized, it seems to me. Or am I missing a theorist? I mean, in some level, Mignolo kind of does this, I think. But a lot of the people who have pretensions to do it are precisely the people like Chakravarti that you're skeptical of in the end, right?
Right.
History 1 and 2, the history of the gods. That's, in the end, in fact, he's just reproducing new narratives of capital and nationalism.
Right. And I agree with a lot of things. And again, it's a very broad question that you're asking, because when you think about Mignolo's work, I mean, Mignolo's work, there isn't much texture, as in Dipesh Chakravarti's work, of the indigenous knowledge that he refers to. So you have mention of Sumak Kausai, Pachamama, but it's not very clear what these concepts are in their density. The other thing to think about when we think about the question of why is it that we are not using the concepts generated from the mouths of people to think about the West, we are functioning within a political economy within which that is not possible. Anybody who's tried submitting an essay to the Comparative Studies in Society and History, which is drawn from only a Filipino world, for example, and Filipino concepts, they'll say, hey, probably you should read the works of X, Y, Z. And to give you an instance, and this is for those, this is a lesson for those who feel that the political economy doesn't exist. This book, Concepts from the Global South, was submitted to Duke, California, etc. And I received very good reports. I also received the second reader's reports, right? And one of the comments was, most people know 2 or 3 languages. Why would anyone want to read a book that has words in 16 languages? And I thought, this is intellectual lethargy. This is not a genuine criticism. So in the end, reading a lot of these, there was this digging in of the heels that happened in the West. And look, we don't need to know too much about, so much about you. No, we know enough. Like, speak to us in our language. Then there were suggestions that I should read more Kozelek and so on, in which militated against the very enterprise that I was doing, which is to theorize from the Global South. So I decided not to go with them. I wrote to them saying, thank you for the good reports. and I didn't waste any time or spleen on the bad reports, then I went with Rutledge, which is a more ideologically agnostic. So this whole question of, is it possible to think from Philippines, think from Kerala, think from Bengal, and then use these ideas to help restructure the wound of the West, right? Because the West is trapped in its own swamp, as it were, and rolling around in it. So the question here is added or linked with that is another question of what are we doing when we say this, right? Even as we are beginning conversations amongst each other, right? And so far, a lot of our theorizing has been like that of Caliban, right? You taught me language, my profit on it is I know how to curse. And most of it is our Eurocentrism, there's Eurocentrism, that we haven't done the work as yet. We have to begin doing this work. And this is why this is a collection of words. There is no systematic theory, which is the other objection to the book, that it doesn't put forward a systematic theory. And the answer was yes, it doesn't put forward a systematic theory. So what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to replace the hegemony and the hubris of one universalism with another? Right? Are we saying that, look, these concepts are better than your concepts? I don't think that's what we're trying to do. The idea is not to generate further universalisms, but to think about what an equal space of conversation might be. That is what dialogue is about, right? Where we speak to each other across our cultures using concepts so that we become, you speak multiple languages of theory and in multiple languages. And therefore, it has to be a multilingual enterprise, not governed by the hegemony of English. So there are multiple questions like that. Otherwise, we are, in many senses, living in the same time. It's one of the ironies of Philippines that it shares the same July 4th, right? So there is a way in which we have been made to fall in line. So, but when we disagree, it's not that of secession, right, of delinking, nor is it indeed of complete replacement, because the enterprise of knowledge, particularly in the times of crisis that we live in, we stand on the precipice with global warming, this, that, and the other. I don't think these arbitrary divisions, it's a common enterprise of thinking about planetarity. And that's what Dipesh Chakravarti's recent work has been trying to think with. So anyway, again, a long answer, but I think each of these questions is opening up multiple spheres of
Yes. Or do you want to answer questions from that are on the screen?
So the first question from Neeraj, I'm really discomforted by the current assertions of learning from ancient Indian texts. Yes, so am I. The discomfort of going back to ancient Indian texts, I share Neeraj's concern, and I've spoken about that in the course of my talk. It's not a question of reaching back into the past to find some untainted source which pre-exists colonialism and so on. The second question, basically, yes, it's both about borrowing ideas from multiple thinkers and applied. Hello? This is censorship.
Can I ask my question? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dilip. I really enjoyed the talk. And I was struck as I was listening to you by the word you used, the word impasse, right? And it seems that really what you present us with is a kind of impasse, right? On the one hand, you just mentioned in your answer the word dialogue. We need dialogue. We need to communicate across boundaries. We need to speak to each other. And in order to speak to each other, we need something that allows us to communicate and to listen to each other. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we need the particularities, we need the heterogeneity of all the languages. We need to know how different we are, and we need to celebrate that in many ways. So the solution is so difficult to find, especially because of the two concepts that you brought at the end, or the two words from your book, So on the one hand, your questions are not mine, and on the other hand, your kind of division of status and your time are not mine, right? So that also just emphasizes that kind of, so then where do we go? So my question to you is, as I was listening to that, it seemed to me that what we need to acknowledge, that actually the thing that makes us puts us in the same time and place and asks the same question is the environment, right? Is the planetary. So I mean, you were a bit coy about the planetary and said, I don't want to,
I could have
whatever
talked
you
for another hour.
Well, let's not invite you to go for another hour, but
Okay.
could you say how you see the planetary book that you're writing as a kind of response to that impasse?
One, I think when I say impasse, the impasse is what we are moving out of. The impasse characterizes a situation that the kind of work that's being done across South America, Africa, Asia is actually moving out of. So the impasse is a thing of the past, right? And the impasse has ended where the steam has gone out of critique, to use Bruno Latour's phrase, right? Where mere critique is not getting it. Now we need to get down to hard tack and theorizing. So when we think about this question of planetarity, that's one way of focusing our attention, where we think about a global crisis, which we are all part of, where many questions arise about knowledge, which are not only about the enterprise that I'm engaged in, which is that of decolonizing the theoretical traditions that I work with, or indeed of the exhaustion of Western theory. It's actually trying to think beyond this. So for example, in Australia, a lot of theorists have begun to engage with oral traditions of the indigenous people, because they realize that it's the people who live and engage with the sea who have a deeper and more intimate knowledge of global waters. So the Yedinji myths, which go back like 10,000 years, so that's 300 generations of oral traditions. People have begun to study those, and where it has been found that the current work being done by geologists, geographers, etc., they are in many senses rediscovering what already existed within oral tradition as to where the barrier reef used to be many generations ago before it was covered by the sea and so on and so forth. Similarly, when you had the tsunami, when you have floods happening on the southwest coast of India, because the weather patterns are shifting. Now there are cyclones that are beginning to occur in the Arabian Sea rather than on the other side. There again, it's the fishermen who know exactly what is happening, who are instrumental in rescuing people in floods and so on. So we're thinking about forms of knowledge, which takes me back to that category that I mentioned of philosophical anthropology, that we need to be working with ideas that are there and working with groups whom we saw as people who lived within oral cultures, so to speak. So that planetarity demands that we go beyond the books and go beyond our philosophical traditions that we work with. That's that's something that is important. The other thing is that it's very clear that this is not an enterprise that is meant for us in our parts of the world, right? Beating our breasts about colonialism. Europe is in crisis. It's not very clear what Europe is, right? And America has jettisoned Europe, and Europe has now become the Protestant nations. It excludes the derogatory term pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. It more or less excludes Scandinavia. It certainly doesn't include Central Europe, right? Both Hungary and Poland are treated with contempt by Western Europe. There is that paranoid fear of Russia invading Europe, which historically has never happened, right? We know this. Russia, in fact, defended Europe in the Battle of Stalingrad. So suddenly Europe is caught in this miasma of ahistoricity, of a lack of identity. So what can we do to help them? Right? And in that sense, when you think about the ways in which the 2015, 2016, the large movements of Syrians who walked across the waters, the only known instance of people walking across waters, the other one is just a myth, right? So they move across the waters into Europe, 1 million of them. And what you have in Europe right now is a political theory that is hugely behind history, where Europe is unable to think beyond agonism, to use Chantal Mouffe's phrase. It's unable to think beyond the idea of citizenship. What would it mean for Europe to think with a theory that actually talks with this planetarity? We are talking about an age of refugees. People are everywhere but where they should be. The Bangladeshi in Venice, which causes Amitav Ghosh to write novel, and so on and so forth. The Sri Lankan in Capri, the Sri Lankan in Canada. People are everywhere. And the subaltern, there's a subaltern cosmopolitanism. But the political theory of Europe is premised on the citizen. What would it mean to have a political theory premised on the refugee, the migrant, the stranger? Right, so we are faced with the crisis is not only ours, it's a planetary crisis, as you put it, where we all need to think about the globe differently. So that's, again, I think each of these questions opens up into other lectures, right? And I'm trying to condense it into, the second question by Satya, who's here, yes, we need to think with thinkers from multiple intellectual traditions and across disciplines, and which is why the book Changing Theory brought in people who are anthropologists, philosophers, historians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right, and so when Satya says that I'm studying agency in auto rickshaw drivers in my city, when we say auto rickshaw drivers, obviously a disaggregated category, because auto rickshaw drivers in any city come from everywhere, right? They're made up of migrants. So to study the Telugu auto rickshaw driver or the Bombay auto rickshaw driver is actually addressing a much larger geography. And so we are thinking about multiple languages, we're thinking about multiple experiences, we're thinking about the collision of categories, we're also thinking about capitalism, right? But capitalism is not the only thing there is, right? This is the other idea that we are stuck with. You know, we all think like the Truman Show, right? That we all live in the shell, there is no outside. But capitalism is one time within which we live, and there are multiple times. You're all familiar with the work of Anat Singh and others who basically argue about capitalism in much more complex ways. So I think this question, Satya's question, opens up this question of when you study a region or a person in a region, you're actually studying something that's national as well as global at the same time, which goes back to the question that you raised as well. I mean, there's no immediate application of a local theory that can happen there. The conversation has to be much larger. Yeah. Okay, so we can go back and forth. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Flair from Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Humanities and teach comparative literature and cultural studies there. I really enjoyed the talk.
Sorry, what was your name again?
Flair. F-A-I-R.
You just sent me a Facebook request, and I've accepted.
Yes. Yeah, because your articles have been featuring in my research and teaching as well. It's really inspiring. So I do have two questions arising from the talk just now. So the first one is about subaltern studies and global South studies, and the fact that subaltern studies is gone, like you said. I just wonder whether the future of global South studies would be very different, but it seems at least currently it's going to be very different because it's more easily co-opted by the states, right? So I just wonder from your perspective, what's the difference in terms of their future trajectories? Okay, and the second one really quickly is about this idea of forging different dialogues among academic traditions or practices from different languages. And here in China, the irony is, so I was trained overseas and I returned, right? And so I'm kind of juggling the two worlds, but I found that in Anglophone academia, if I work as a Chinese scholar, it's easier to find companions and, you know, like-minded people to criticize like Anglophone or English hegemony, colonialism, this kind of thing. But then Chinese academia, it's actually more difficult, right? Most of the social sciences and humanities scholarship might just collapse if you don't engage with white man theory, let's say, just be as explicit as that, right? That's the paradigm. And when they write in Chinese, because you're writing in Chinese, you have to rely on something that's more quite universal, right? So even the global South is turned into part of this universal theory, and it's more easily co-opted by the states, like the state also hypes it up here, right? So I just wonder, in that kind of dilemma, then how do we actually engage with the local in that sense? Because the agendas can be very different, especially when there is a language barrier, when the agendas are very different, when you don't engage in direct dialogue. So in a way, you can be more appropriative and only working for local interests rather than the international battle against epistemic violence, colonialism, all that. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, this is again, I mean, all of you are asking very vast questions. So I'll try and be brief about them. The second question, yes, we goes back to the question of imperial durabilities. We still live in the age of colonialism. We are people who lack self-confidence. We lack the temerity to produce theory. And that's something that we need to think about. For each of us to think about in the spaces that we are, is why we lack that self-confidence. To argue that the knowledge that we produce is sufficient, that we need it for conversations amongst each other, that we don't constantly need to be like sunflowers. We're constantly following what is happening in the West like that. When France catches a cold, we sneeze, those kinds of, which is Metternich's phrase, not mine. So when we think about all of that, that's the first question. Why is it that we lack the intellectual self-confidence and temerity, even though we are not colonized? And that's modernity coloniality. Then the second question is, who are our conversations going to be with, right? What does it mean that even now in India, Africa, and I don't know about China, possibly true in China, that a publication in a foreign journal is considered more valuable than a publication in a local one, right? And all of these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. These are fundamental questions which are about a crisis that faces us as intellectuals. That if we continue with this political economy, this whole project of new knowledge already has its legs cut off, right? Because we're not concerned with conversations with each other at all. In fact, we don't see these as important. And the way in which this is emphasized within the political economy is, well, it's difficult for China and Japan and Korea to have a conversation, too many historical memories, And you think, hello, aren't there historical memories that plague you in Europe? And you're afraid of Russia invading England? I mean, like, where does that come from? This kind of, or the relation between the Protestant countries and the Catholic countries, but somehow we have accepted that there is a universality, a secularity, a modernity to those spaces. We are mired in these regional conflicts and historical memories, which will not allow us to engage in conversations. And I think these are all questions that we need to be thinking with. So I think we stand at the beginning of something, but that beginning will not happen unless we have the self-confidence. And which is why, for me, it's important to have moved to South Africa, because South Africa, I mean, the 16 years that I've been there, it's a country that has proved itself to be redoubtable in its demand for justice. It's the only country in the world to have taken Israel to the International Criminal Court for the genocide that it's committing. The only country out of 200 nations. What does this mean? So I think for me, being in South Africa, the project of knowledge is being emphasized much more, that you need to have a sense of integrity, ethics, and independence, right, for any of this to succeed. So that question that you ask, right? Otherwise, what happens is that these theories that we produce are immediately taken up by the government. So the Global South, BRICS, all of these become governmental categories, administrative categories, rather than intellectual categories. And the conversations happen in some kind of rarefied compromise space, not amongst ourselves. And for me, being here and being at Tsinghua and carrying on these conversations, I realize how badly these conversations are needed. That we're all in our silos thinking similar thoughts, but somehow we don't speak to each other. We are like iron filings which arrange ourselves to the magnet that is there, right? We all fall in line, in one straight line. Can I answer a question here?
Yes, sorry.
I can go on forever. In India, we do 2-hour lectures followed by 3 hours of questions.
No, so in the interest of time and
yes.
dinner,
And Dinner? What's dinner?
No, this is the last question that we will have for this evening, and it's from Chorsi Chan. And yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your mesmerizing talk. I am very blind, so I have to bend down.
Can I read it out?
I am a PhD candidate studying in India, so I'm very interested in how to foster dialogue between different contexts as well as translating and understanding everyday words as concepts. I am curious, one, if you think there is any yardstick for us to evaluate what everyday word can be useful for concepts, and two, how do we deal with the tension between trying to translate concepts, say in Chen Quanzhang's sense, and accepting opacity and commensurability, and three, if we now have to rethink the placeholder global south, then how do we decide concepts of which contexts that we try to put into conversation? I'm particularly interested in this because sometimes I feel like Hong Kong is an anomaly that doesn't fit neatly in the global south, and there are also multiple contexts we can consider beyond the units of global south nations. There are 3 questions, pick one.
I know, but I think they're all important, and I could speak for 30 minutes on each. No, but the first question, what words do we choose? I think this is a choice that is not governed by some theory that precedes it. And here I would refer you to works by Veena Das, Stanley Cavell, Wittgenstein, that whole tradition of how do you think with ordinary life and concepts, rather than a theory that stands above, it determines what word becomes a concept. So I am working with everyday words. And that's the paper that I'm presenting at Peking University, where I've taken a word that people use every day, which also has weight within the Communist Party and in structuring patriarchy in the region that I come from. So I leave it there since Udukkam, which Udukkam, Desi, you asked the question. I have to answer that. Udukkam is a word, to give very briefly, Udukkam moves across several terrains. So if, let's say, I'm in a train in a second-class compartment in India, those of you who have traveled in a second-class compartment would know that, and you scatter your belongings, and then people will tell you, hey, odukki vekanam, keep it all together, right? You will also have in a home a mother telling the daughter, you must have udukkam, which is you must have feminine comportment. You must contain yourself. In the Communist Party, they discipline young Turks, young men who get too uppity, by exercising udukkam on them, right? So this word moves from conversations at the dinner table to party hierarchy to everyday conversation in trains, buses, and so on. So that's words come to us out of people's mouth. So which goes back to this question of what is a word that can become a concept? That's up to you. You have to work with that word to establish that landscape, right, of conceptual entailments, a philosophical anthropology, as it were. But Hong Kong doesn't fit neatly in the global south. I wonder which country fits neatly in the global south. China is 35 degrees north. India is 7 degrees north. Right? Nepal fits exactly, right? And then Australia fits but doesn't fit, right? So I think it's what Gayatri Spivak in another innocent time called strategic essentialism, right? That the idea of the global south is a way of it's a placeholder. It allows certain ideas to cohere. It's not a geographical entity. It's not an empirical entity. And therefore, I think the idea of whether Hong Kong fits into the global south depends on the conversations that Hong Kong wants to have. If Hong Kong wishes to converse with African philosophy and Indian philosophy, then it is part of a global south conversation. And I mean, this question is very interesting. Anthony Ng's question on India's caste and how can we reinterpret local structures through oceanic thinking. No concept is local, right? I mean, when you think about the idea of caste, the ocean is what has allowed caste to be fragmented as subaltern groups travel across the ocean, make money, and are scattered in diasporic landscapes from Madagascar, Fiji, South Africa. What is it? Well, I mean, the word caste. Caste existed. It's a long stain. Yeah, why not use jati instead of caste? That's one way of looking at it. But also the idea that caste travels across the ocean as well, so that most of the academics in the United States are Brahmins, right, who have escaped social transformation of India and availed of affirmative action in the US to find themselves jobs. So caste also functions in those. That's a polemical thing. I know I've lost 300 friends by saying that. But, so caste and the ocean work in very many contradictory and complicated, emancipatory, conservative, and multiple ways. But that's another lecture on oceanic thinking, for which I would recommend the book Oceaner's Method. But thank you so much.
That note, after having lost 300 friends, it's okay. He lost 300 friends this evening. But thank you so much for that incredible and provocative talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to hang back and talk to Professor Menon. Of course you can, and he will approve it. He will accept it.
And one of the principles which I've learned from my former teacher, somebody writes me an email, I reply. Right. So and there are people who say, "Oh, I get 150 emails a day," and which is not true. They don't. But the other thing is that of respect. When somebody sends an email, the first thing to do is to reply to it. So if anyone wishes to engage in further questions and so on, I am there.
On that note, thank you again, and
thank you.
Welcome to come back anytime.